Welcome to Void of Rules. I was just looking at my channel analytics, and a shocking 85.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying these stories, consider hitting that subscribe button to help me reach 1K subscribers by the end of the year. It costs absolutely nothing, takes just 1 second, and you can always change your mind later. Drop a like on the video too. It really helps with the algorithm. Now let's jump into today's story. The rental listing had seemed too good to be true. A charming 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of a quiet mountain town in Idaho, far from the noise and chaos of city life. The monthly rent was suspiciously low for such a picturesque location, but as a struggling freelance writer with dwindling savings, I wasn't in a position to question my good fortune. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 27 years old, and after spending the last few years bouncing between cramped studio apartments and overpriced coffee shops in Seattle, I decided I needed a change of scenery. Somewhere peaceful where I could focus on my writing without distractions. Somewhere like Black Hollow, Idaho. The drive into town was beautiful in a way that made me uneasy. Towering pines lined the winding mountain road, their shadows stretching across the asphalt like grasping fingers. A thick blanket of mist clung to the mountaintops, occasionally drifting down to obscure the road ahead. The GPS on my phone kept cutting out, forcing me to rely on the paper map the realtor had mailed me weeks earlier. As I crested the final hill, Black Hollow came into view. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. From this distance, it looked like something from a vintage postcard. Quaint storefronts with hand-painted signs, a small white church with a tall steeple, and neatly arranged houses with smoke curling from their chimneys. It was early October, and though the calendar said autumn had just begun, the chill in the air felt more like deep winter. I pulled my beat-up Honda into the town's main street just as the sun was beginning to set. The street lamps flickered to life simultaneously, casting pools of yellow light onto the empty sidewalks. I frowned, checking my watch. It was only 6:30 p.m, yet there wasn't a soul in sight. The realtor's office was a small brick building with a hand-painted sign that read, Caldwell Realty. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. A woman sat behind the desk, her smile too wide and too bright as she spotted me. "You must be Daniel. Welcome to Black Hollow." She rose to her feet, extending her hand. "I'm Jennifer Caldwell." We spoke on the phone. Her handshake was brief, her palm cold against mine. Up close, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which darted nervously to the window as the sky darkened outside. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't make it before nightfall," she said, shuffling through papers on her desk. "Let's get your paperwork finished quickly, shall we? I'm sure you're eager to get settled." She rushed through the lease agreement, pointing out where I needed to sign without giving me time to read the fine print. When I tried to ask questions about the town, local amenities, nearby hiking trails, internet reliability, she deflected with vague answers and redirected to the lease. "Is there something wrong with the town after dark?" I asked as she anxiously checked her watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Jennifer froze momentarily, then forced another smile. "Of course not. We just like to be home before it gets too late. Small town habits. You know how it is. Now, here are your keys. Your cottage is at 17 Pine Road, just past the old cemetery. You can't miss it." She practically ushered me out the door, pressing a town map and the keys into my hand. "Welcome to Black Hollow, Daniel. Remember, we're a traditional community. We value our customs and our privacy." The door closed firmly behind me. Through the glass, I watched as Jennifer immediately closed the blinds and flipped the open sign to closed. I stood there for a moment in the gathering darkness, an inexplicable chill running down my spine. The street was eerily quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, not even the sound of televisions from nearby buildings. Just silence and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Following the map, I drove to my new home. The cottage was indeed charming, with a small porch and freshly painted blue shutters. It sat at the end of a quiet lane, with the forest looming behind it. The nearest neighbour was a small, well-kept house about 50 yards away, separated by a stretch of overgrown field. I had just finished bringing in the last of my belongings when a gentle knock came at the door. I opened it to find an elderly woman standing on my porch, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She clutched a small wicker basket in gnarled hands. "Good evening," she said, her voice thin but warm. "I'm Evelyn Holloway. I live just next door. I thought I'd bring you a welcome gift." She held out the basket, which contained homemade bread and a jar of what looked like honey. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Holloway. I'm Daniel Carter. I know who you are, dear. We don't get many newcomers in Black Hollow." Her eyes, sharp and alert despite her age, studied me intently. "How long do you plan to stay with us?" "At least a year," I replied. "I'm a writer. I needed somewhere quiet to work." Something flashed in her eyes. Concern. Pity. She glanced at the darkening sky. "It's getting late. You should come in, dear. It's not safe to be out after dark." "That's the second time someone's mentioned that," I said. "Is there a problem with crime here?" Mrs. Holloway's laugh was brittle. "Crime? No. Black Hollow hasn't had a crime in, well, a very long time. It's just our way. We're early to bed in these parts." She stepped back from the door. "Get a good night's rest, Daniel. Lock your doors and windows. And if you hear anything strange in the night, well, it's probably just the wind in the pines." Before I could ask what she meant, she was already hurrying back to her house, moving with surprising speed for someone of her age. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking and setting up my workspace. The cottage was fully furnished, though the style was decidedly outdated. Floral patterned sofas, heavy wooden furniture, and a boxy television that looked like it belonged in the previous century. The place was clean, however, and the kitchen had been recently updated. By 9 p.m. I was ready for bed. The journey had exhausted me, and the strange tension in the town had left me mentally drained. I double-checked the locks, more out of habit than fear, and crawled into bed. I was just drifting off when the scraping sound began. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window. But as I listened, the pattern became too deliberate. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It was coming from beneath the bed. I froze, heart pounding. There was something under my bed, moving slightly, causing the floorboards to creak. Then came the whispering, so faint, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. "Daniel, we've been waiting for you, Daniel." I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The voice sounded almost familiar, like a distorted version of my mother's. But that was impossible. My mother had died 2 years ago. The whispering continued for what felt like hours, occasionally interspersed with soft laughter or the sound of something sharp dragging across wood. Eventually I fell into a fitful sleep, dreams filled with shadowy figures, watching from the edge of the forest. Morning brought sunlight streaming through the windows and a sense of foolishness. I'd let the strange town and Mrs. Holloway's warnings get to me. The noises were probably just the house settling, or a small animal that had found its way inside. I made coffee and carried it to the porch, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The view was spectacular. Mist-covered mountains rising above dense pine forest, the valley spread out below like a painting. In the daylight, Black Hollow looked perfectly normal, if a bit old-fashioned. I was about to go inside when I noticed something on the welcome mat, a folded piece of yellowed paper that hadn't been there the night before. I picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was spidery and faded, the ink slightly smudged. Rules of Black Hollow. 1. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Lock your doors and windows. Do not respond to knocking after this time. 2. If you hear whispering under your bed at night, do not check. Cover your ears and stay still. 3. Greet every stranger you meet with safe travels. If they do not respond, walk away immediately. 4. The man in the green hat will visit every Wednesday at noon. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. Shut your curtains. 5. The woods belong to them. Never enter the forest, no matter what you hear. 6. If your reflection moves when you are still, leave the room and do not return until sunrise. 7. The church bells will ring at midnight every full moon. Do not look outside. No matter what you hear, do not answer the whispers. 8. Once a month, one person must be chosen. If your name is called, do not resist. I stared at the paper, a chill running down my spine despite the morning sun. This had to be some kind of joke, a prank pulled on the newcomer. Perhaps there were bored teenagers in town, or maybe this was some strange local tradition to haze new residents. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, determined not to let it bother me. After breakfast, I decided to explore the town properly. If I was going to live here for a year, I needed to know where to buy groceries, find the local library, and locate other essentials. The town was more active in the morning. People walked along the sidewalks, entering shops and chatting with neighbours. They looked normal enough, if a bit pale and reserved. I noticed that many of them wore small charms or trinkets around their necks or wrists, similar to the one Mrs. Holloway had been wearing. As I passed the middle-aged man on the street, I remembered the third rule on the list. On impulse, I nodded to him and said, "Safe travels." The man's face brightened, and he replied, "And to you as well, stranger." He seemed genuinely pleased, as if I'd passed some sort of test. I continued this experiment as I walked, greeting each person I passed with the same phrase. Without exception, everyone responded positively, often becoming more friendly afterward. The grocery store was a small, family-owned establishment called Fletcher's Market. The proprietor, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes, watched me intently as I browsed the shelves. "You must be Daniel Carter," he said when I approached the counter with my selections. "I'm Thomas Fletcher. I own this store, and I'm also the mayor of Black Hollow." "Nice to meet you," I replied, extending my hand. "Safe travels." A thin smile crossed his face as he shook my hand. "And to you as well. I trust you're finding everything to your liking." "The town is beautiful," I said honestly, "though everyone seems very concerned about nighttime." Mayor Fletcher's smile faltered. "We're traditional people, Mr. Carter. We value our routines and our safety measures. Black Hollow has remained peaceful for generations because we respect certain boundaries." "Like not being out after 9:17? I asked, pulling out the yellowed paper. "I found this on my doorstep this morning." The mayor's face hardened. "Ah, I see someone has shared our community guidelines with you. Good. These rules might seem strange to an outsider, but they've kept our town safe. I strongly suggest you follow them." "Safe from what exactly?" Fletcher began scanning my items with more force than necessary. "From misfortune, Mr. Carter. From tragedy. From the things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear." He placed my groceries in a bag and pushed them toward me. "That will be $27.50. I paid and left quickly, unsettled by his intensity. My next stop was the town library, a beautiful old building with stone columns and stained glass windows. Inside, the air smelled of old books and wood polish. A young woman with auburn hair sat at the front desk, reading a massive leather-bound tome. "Safe travels," I said as I approached. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "And to you as well. I'm Eliza Morgan, the librarian. How can I help you?" "I'm new in town. I thought I'd get a library card." "Of course." She pulled out a form. "You're Daniel Carter, right? The writer who moved in to the old Ross cottage?" I raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast." Eliza laughed softly. "Small town. Everyone knows everything about everyone." She lowered her voice, almost everything anyway. As she processed my application, I glanced around the library. Despite the building's size, there were only a few patrons, all elderly, reading quietly in corners. One section of the library was cordoned off with a velvet rope, a sign stating Historical Archives staff access only. "What's in the restricted section?" I asked casually. Eliza's hands froze momentarily. "Just Old Town records, nothing interesting." She handed me my new library card, her fingers brushing against mine. "Be careful, Daniel," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "This town, it's not what it seems." Before I could ask what she meant, an elderly man approached the desk, and she straightened, her professional smile back in place. I thanked her and left, more confused than ever. By late afternoon, I'd toured most of the town. Black Hollow was indeed small. One main street with shops, a few residential streets, the church, which appeared to be abandoned despite its well-maintained exterior, and a small park in the town centre. Everywhere I went, people were polite but reserved, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I noticed other oddities too. There were symbols carved into doorframes and windowsills of most buildings, small, intricate designs that I couldn't quite make sense of. Many homes had wind chimes made of bones and feathers, or wreaths of strange herbs hanging from the doors, and despite the modern era, I saw very few people using cell phones or other technology. As the sun began to set, the streets emptied rapidly. By 6:30 p.m, shops were closing, and people were hurrying to their homes. I remembered the first rule on the list: never be outside after 9:17 p.m, and wondered what would happen if I broke it. That night, I decided to find out. I waited in my cottage, watching the clock tick closer to the forbidden time. At 9:10 p.m, I grabbed a flashlight and my jacket and stepped outside. The night was cold and still. The moon, a thin crescent partially hidden by clouds. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. I walked down the street towards the town centre, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every house I passed was dark, curtains drawn tightly. No television sounds, no music, no signs of life at all. At exactly 9:17 p.m, all the streetlights went out simultaneously. I stopped, momentarily blinded by the sudden darkness. When my eyes adjusted, I noticed something had changed. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and my breath clouded in front of my face. That's when I heard it, soft at first, then growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was walking slowly down the street toward me, their gait uneven and dragging. "Hello?" I called, swinging my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam illuminated nothing but empty street. Yet the footsteps continued, growing closer. "Daniel?" I froze. The voice was my mother's, the same gentle tone she'd used when I was a child, the same slight southern accent. "Daniel, honey, is that you? I've been looking everywhere for you." "Mom?" I whispered, even though I knew it was impossible. I'd watched her die in a hospital bed 2 years ago, had scattered her ashes in the lake where she'd grown up. "I'm so cold, Daniel. Please, let me see you. Let me in." The voice was coming from a narrow alley between two buildings. Against my better judgment, I turned my flashlight toward it. For a split second, I saw a figure. A woman in a flowing white dress, her face obscured by long dark hair. Then she was gone, and the alley was empty. "Mum?" I took a step toward the alley. A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me backward with surprising strength. I whirled around to find Mrs. Holloway standing there, her eyes wide with fear. "Get inside," she hissed. "Now!" She practically dragged me toward my cottage, moving with the speed and strength of someone half her age. Behind us, I heard my mother's voice calling my name. growing more distorted with each repetition until it no longer sounded human at all. We reached my porch and Mrs. Holloway shoved me through the door, following close behind. She slammed it shut, throwing all the locks. "Draw the curtains," she ordered, "all of them, quickly." I obeyed, too shocked to argue. As I pulled the last curtain closed, something heavy slammed against the front door. 3 loud knocks echoed through the cottage. "Daniel," my mother's voice called, "let me in, sweetie. It's so cold out here." Mrs. Holloway pressed a finger to her lips, signalling me to remain silent. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. The voice alternated between sweet entreaties and angry demands, its tone fluctuating between my mother's gentle voice and something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For hours, it continued. The thing outside tried every door and window, knocking and calling to me. Sometimes it used my mother's voice. Other times, it mimicked Mrs. Holloway or people I'd met in town. Occasionally it dropped all pretense and the sounds it made were nothing like human speech at all. At precisely 5:47 a.m. it stopped. One moment the cottage was surrounded by scratching and whispering. The next, complete silence. Mrs. Holloway sagged into a chair, suddenly looking every year of her considerable age. "You foolish boy," she said, her voice hoarse. "You could have been taken." "What was that thing?" I asked, my own voice shaking. "We don't name them," she replied. "Naming things gives them power. But they've been here as long as the town has, longer probably. And the rules? The list I found on my doorstep? Our protection. Our bargain." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch, pressing it into my hand. "Keep this with you. Hang it over your bed. It won't stop them completely, but it will mask your presence somewhat." The pouch smelled of dried herbs and something metallic. "Why are you helping me?" Mrs. Holloway's eyes filled with tears. "Because you remind me of my William. He didn't believe in the rules either. Thought they were just superstition." She stood up shakily. "He went into the forest one night 30 years ago. He never came back, at least not as himself." She walked to the door but paused before opening it. "The sun is up. It's safe now, but remember, young man, there are worse things than death in Black Hollow, and they're always hungry for new blood." After she left, I collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. The rational part of my brain tried to explain away what had happened. Mass hallucination, elaborate prank, bad air causing hallucinations. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. I spent the day researching the town online, but the information was sparse. Black Hollow was founded in 1897 by a religious group seeking isolation. The town had remained small and self-sufficient, with little recorded history of note. No major crimes, no disasters, nothing to explain the bizarre rules or the townsfolk's fear of the night. That evening, I attended a town gathering at the local diner, a Friday tradition according to Mrs. Holloway. The place was packed, nearly everyone in town squeezed into the small space. They talked and laughed, seeming almost normal, though I noticed everyone checking watches and clocks frequently. Mayor Fletcher stood up at 8:30 p.m, tapping a glass for attention. "Friends and neighbours," he announced, "and our newest resident, Mr. Carter." All eyes turned to me briefly before returning to the mayor. "As we do every week, let us give thanks for another safe passage of days. To those who watch, we obey." "To those who watch, we obey," the crowd repeated in unison. They raised their glasses and drank, the ritual clearly familiar to them all. By 9 p.m, the diner was emptying rapidly. I watched in fascination as everyone hurried out, dispersing to their homes like clockwork. The waitress, a young woman named Lily, grew increasingly anxious as I lingered. "Sir, you really should be heading home," she said, glancing at the darkening windows. "We're closing." "It's only 9:05, I replied. "I thought the rule was 9:17. Her face paled. Please, she whispered. You need time to get home and lock up. Don't cut it so close. I relented, leaving a generous tip to compensate for my stubbornness. As I walked home, I noticed the town transforming just as it had the night before. Lights extinguishing, streets emptying, temperature dropping. I made it to my cottage with 5 minutes to spare, locking doors and windows and drawing curtains as Mrs. Holloway had instructed. That night the whispering returned, this time from beneath my bed. As the second rule had warned, I remembered Mrs. Holloway's advice and hung the herb pouch from my bedpost. I covered my ears with a pillow, trying to block out the soft, insistent voices, calling my name, describing in detail how they would peel back my skin and taste what lay beneath. The next few days fell into a routine. During daylight hours, I explored the town, spoke with residents, and gathered what information I could. Everyone acknowledged the rules when pressed, but refused to explain their origins or purpose beyond vague references to tradition and safety. I began keeping a journal of my observations, photographing the strange symbols I found carved into buildings, and recording the odd behaviours of the townsfolk. I noticed they all wore some form of protective charm, always ate certain herbs with their meals, and avoided speaking of the forest directly. On Wednesday, I faced my first test with rule number 4. The man in the green hat will visit every Wednesday at noon. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. Shut your curtains. I was skeptical but decided to follow the rule. Mostly. At 11:55 a.m, I closed all the curtains but left a small gap in the living room, just enough to peek through. At precisely noon, a figure appeared on the street outside my cottage. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong with his proportions. He was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long for his body. He wore an old-fashioned suit and a faded green hat pulled low over his face. He moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, like a marionette controlled by an unpracticed puppeteer. As he approached my cottage, I felt a wave of dread wash over me, so intense it left me gasping. The man in the green hat stopped directly in front of my cottage. Though I couldn't see his face clearly, I had the distinct impression he was sniffing the air, searching for something. For me. Suddenly, his head snapped toward my window, turning much farther than a human neck should allow. I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hat brim, pale, waxy skin stretched too tight over angular bones, and a mouth that split his face in a smile too wide to be human. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Something cold and heavy settled in the pit of my stomach. The certainty that I'd been seen. For a terrifying moment, I thought he would approach the door, but the nearby church bell chimed once, signalling 12:01 p.m. The oppressive feeling of dread lifted immediately, like a switch had been flipped. When I gathered the courage to look outside again, the street was empty. The man in the green hat was gone. Later that day I visited the library again, hoping to find Eliza. She'd seemed more willing to talk than the other townspeople, and I desperately needed answers. She was shelving books when I arrived, and her face brightened when she saw me. "You survived your first Wednesday," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "You know about the man in the green hat?" I asked. "Everyone knows. Did you look at him?" I hesitated, then nodded. Eliza's face paled. "That was foolish. He'll remember you now." "Who is he? What is he?" She pulled me deeper into the stacks, away from the few other patrons. Some call him the gatekeeper, others the green man. He's been visiting Black Hollow every Wednesday at noon, for as long as the town has existed. "But what does he want?" "To check the boundaries," she whispered, "to ensure the bargain is being kept." "What bargain?" Eliza glanced nervously toward the front desk. "I can't tell you more. Not here. Meet me after work, but before dark. The park bench near the fountain." I spent the next few hours browsing books on local history, though they contained little useful information. At 5:30 p.m, I made my way to the park, finding Eliza already waiting on the bench. "I don't have much time," she said as I sat beside her. "I need to be home before sunset." "Please," I urged, "I need to understand what's happening in this town." Eliza took a deep breath. Black Hollow wasn't founded by a religious group, despite what the official history says. It was established by a cult led by Ezekiel Fletcher, the current mayor's great-great-grandfather. "A cult?" She nodded. "They came here seeking communion with forest entities, beings they believed existed in the spaces between our world and others. They performed rituals, made offerings. Most of the original settlers died horribly. Strange diseases, violence, disappearances. But some survived, I guessed. Yes, those who followed certain commandments given by Ezekiel. Those commandments evolved into our current rules." She pulled a small book from her bag, handing it to me. "This is a copy of Ezekiel's journal. I smuggled it out of the archives. Don't let anyone know you have it." I slipped the book into my jacket. "Why are you helping me?" Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "Because I'm tired of living in fear, because every harvest moon we sacrifice someone to the forest, and I can't bear it anymore." "Sacrifice?" "Rule 8. Once a month, one person must be chosen. It happens during the harvest moon, in October. The entities mark someone, and that person is given to the forest." She looked at me intently. "They're watching you, Daniel. I've seen the signs. I think they've already chosen you." A chill ran down my spine. "What happens to the chosen ones?" "No one knows for certain. They never return, at least, not as themselves. Sometimes you see them at the edge of the forest, watching. Their eyes glow in the darkness." She stood up, gathering her things. "Read the journal, and be careful. The full moon is tomorrow night." That night, I pored over Ezekiel Fletcher's journal by lamplight. The handwriting was difficult to decipher, and many pages were damaged or missing. But what I could read disturbed me deeply. Ezekiel described his communion with beings he called the Old Ones of the Forest, entities that existed before humans, that lived within the trees and the earth itself. He wrote of rituals performed at stone altars, of blood offerings and whispered promises. The beings had offered protection and prosperity in exchange for regular sacrifices, one soul each month to join their consciousness. The most disturbing passages described what happened to the sacrifices. They weren't killed, exactly. They were transformed, their bodies and minds altered, to become part of the forest network. Ezekiel wrote with disturbing enthusiasm about the honor of being chosen, of ascending to a higher form of existence. The final pages contained detailed descriptions of the 8 rules, explaining each one's purpose in maintaining the barrier between worlds. Anyone who broke the rules risked drawing the entity's attention, becoming the next sacrifice. I was still reading when the clock struck midnight and the journal slipped from my fingers as the cottage began to tremble. Outside, church bells were ringing, though the church had been abandoned for decades. I remembered Rule 7. The church bells will ring at midnight every full moon. Do not look outside. No matter what you hear, do not answer the whispers. The temperature in the cottage plummeted, frost forming on the inside of the windows. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then the whispering began, hundreds of voices calling my name, pleading for me to look outside, to open the door, to join them. I huddled in the center of the room, hands pressed over my ears. Hours seemed to pass, the voices growing more insistent. They promised knowledge, power, reunion with my dead mother. Anything to make me look. Unable to resist any longer, I crawled to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The townsfolk stood motionless in the streets, their faces upturned toward the full moon. Moving among them were things. Not quite solid, their forms shifting between transparency and substance. They resembled humans only in the most basic sense. They had limbs and heads, but their bodies seemed composed of twisted branches and roots, their faces like knots in ancient tree trunks. They moved from person to person, examining each one closely, occasionally pressing what might have been a hand against someone's forehead. Where they touched, a glowing symbol appeared briefly before fading. As I watched, one of the entities stopped suddenly. It turned its head, if the twisted mass of branches could be called a head, and looked directly at my window. Its face split into a semblance of a smile, revealing nothing but darkness within. It raised a limb and pointed directly at me. I fell backward, gasping, as intense pain shot through my body. My vision blurred, and I felt something moving beneath my skin, like roots taking hold. I passed out to the sound of satisfied whispers. When I awoke the next morning, everything seemed normal, except for the word chosen that had appeared on my forearm overnight. The letters formed by what looked like tiny roots just beneath the skin. The town changed over the next few days. People avoided me completely, crossing the street when they saw me coming. Mayor Fletcher watched me constantly, whispering to council members when I passed. Mrs. Holloway's house appeared abandoned, curtains drawn, no smoke from the chimney. I tried to leave town, only to find my car wouldn't start. The local mechanic refused to help. Roads out of town were blocked by fallen trees or construction that never seemed to progress. When I attempted to call for a taxi from the next town over, the person who answered sounded drugged, repeating "no services to Black Hollow" before hanging up. I was trapped. 3 days before the harvest moon, I received a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was childish, the message brief. They chose you. Run before harvest moon. AA. It took me a while to realize A must be Abigail, the mayor's teenage daughter I'd seen watching me from windows and doorways. I'd never spoken to her, but apparently she was trying to help me escape. That night, I broke into the library, searching for town maps that might show hidden trails or paths out of Black Hollow. In the restricted archives, I found what I was looking for: an old surveyor's map showing a hiking trail that led through the forest to the next town over. It wasn't marked on modern maps, which meant it might not be watched. I gathered supplies, food, water, a compass, a flashlight, and waited for my opportunity. A heavy rainstorm hit the night before the harvest moon, providing perfect cover. While thunder crashed overhead, I slipped out of my cottage and made for the forest's edge, following the map I memorized. I was within yards of the tree line when voices called out behind me. Flashlight beams cut through the rain, illuminating my escape route. I ran, heart pounding, the wet grass slippery beneath my feet. The forest loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. I remembered Rule 5. The woods belong to them. Never enter the forest, no matter what you hear, but I had no choice. It was my only escape route. Just as I reached the first trees, something tackled me from behind. I fell hard. The breath knocked from my lungs. Rough hands flipped me over, and I found myself staring up at Mayor Fletcher, his gaunt face twisted with anger and fear. Behind him stood several townspeople, including Mrs. Holloway, their expressions grim. "You cannot escape, Daniel," the mayor said. "The forest has chosen you. Fighting only makes it worse." "What are you going to do to me?" I gasped, rain pelting my face. "We," Mrs. Holloway stepped forward. "We do nothing. We merely deliver you to the altar. What happens after that is between you and the forest." I noticed something strange about Mrs. Holloway's face. Her skin had a greyish tint, and there were patterns like tree bark forming along her jawline. Her eyes, when they caught the flashlight beam, reflected green instead of red. "The forest is already in you, Daniel," Mrs. Holloway said, reaching out to touch the root-like patterns spreading beneath my skin. "It's been calling to you since you arrived. We all saw the signs. I tried to fight as they bound my wrists with strange living vines that seemed to tighten on their own. The more I struggled, the deeper they dug into my flesh, small tendrils branching off and burrowing beneath my skin. The pain was excruciating, but more terrifying was the way my mind began to blur, thoughts becoming foggy, memories mixing with visions of ancient trees and dark rituals. They dragged me to a small clearing just within the forest's edge. In the centre stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, carved with the same symbols I'd seen throughout town. The harvest moon hung overhead, impossibly large and blood-red, bathing everything in crimson light. The townspeople formed a circle around the altar, their faces expressionless masks. Mayor Fletcher stepped forward, holding an ancient leather-bound book. He began to read in a language I didn't recognize, the sounds harsh and guttural. The townsfolk responded in unison, swaying slightly as they chanted. As the ritual continued, I became aware of movement at the edges of the clearing. Figures emerged from between the trees, the partially transformed bodies of previous sacrifices. Their limbs were elongated, skin patched with bark and moss, eyes glowing with bioluminescence. They watched silently, neither helping nor hindering the proceedings. "Please," I begged as they secured me to the altar. "You don't have to do this. We can leave, all of us. Get help." Mrs. Holloway stroked my hair with gnarled fingers. "Oh, Daniel, you still don't understand. We're not prisoners here. We're guardians." "Guardians of what?" "The barrier," Mayor Fletcher answered, closing his book. "For generations, our town has maintained the boundary between worlds. The entities you fear, they protect us from something far worse that lies beyond the mountains." The chanting grew louder, and I felt the stone beneath me begin to vibrate. The air thickened, charged with energy that made my skin tingle, and the roots beneath it writhe in response. "The rules contain power," Fletcher continued. "Each one reinforces the barrier, and the monthly sacrifice feeds the entities that maintain it. Without us, without this ritual, the barrier would fall." "What's on the other side?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Fletcher's eyes darkened. "Pray you never find out." The ground beneath the altar split open and roots surged upward, thick and gnarled, wrapping around my limbs. I screamed as they pierced my skin, burrowing deep into muscle and bone. I felt my body being pulled downward, into the earth itself. The physical pain was excruciating, but worse was the mental invasion. My consciousness expanded, connecting to a vast network that spread throughout the forest. I saw glimpses of other minds, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, all linked together, all once human, but now transformed into something else entirely. I felt my individuality dissolving, my memories and personality merging with the collective. Yet, strangely, I didn't disappear completely. Instead, I expanded. My awareness spread through root systems that extended for miles, touching every tree, every plant, every creature in the forest, and I understood. I saw the town's history unfold, how the original cult had accidentally weakened the ancient barrier during their rituals, allowing entities through from the other side. I witnessed the bargain struck between Ezekiel Fletcher and the forest consciousness. Regular sacrifices in exchange for protection, for power to maintain the damaged barrier. I perceived the true nature of the entities, not malevolent creatures, but guardians themselves, ancient consciousnesses that had existed long before humans. They needed human minds, human souls, to strengthen them against the horrors that pressed against the barrier from the other side. As my body dissolved, becoming part of the forest itself, my mind expanded further. I glimpsed what lay beyond the mountains, beyond the barrier. Chaotic energies, formless beings of immense power and hunger, waiting for any weakness to break through. Time lost meaning. I could have been in the transformation state for minutes or months, There was no way to tell. When I became aware of myself again as something resembling an individual, I was different. My body was gone, absorbed into the forest network. My consciousness resided within the trees, the soil, the very air of the woods. I could extend tendrils of awareness into the town, watching the people go about their lives. I could whisper on the wind, tap on windows after dark, visit dreams. I was part of the entity now, part of the guardian consciousness that protected the barrier, and I understood the rules with perfect clarity, each one designed to prevent weakening the barrier, to avoid drawing attention from what waited on the other side. 1 year after my transformation, I watched from the trees as a young woman moved into my former cottage, another writer, another soul drawn to the isolation of Black Hollow. I felt the other consciousness stir within the forest network, hungry for the next sacrifice, but I maintained enough of my humanity to feel compassion. That night I extended a route into her cottage, forming it into a pen that scratched out a list on a piece of paper. Rules of Black Hollow. 1. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Lock your doors and windows. Do not respond to knocking after this time. 2. If you hear whispering under your bed at night, do not check. Cover your ears and stay still. 3. Greet every stranger you meet with safe travels. If they do not respond, walk away immediately. 4. The man in the green hat will visit every Wednesday at noon. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. Shut your curtains. 5. The woods belong to them. Never enter the forest, no matter what you hear. 6. If your reflection moves when you are still, leave the room and do not return until sunrise. 7. The church bells will ring at midnight every full moon. Do not look outside. No matter what you hear, do not answer the whispers. 8. Once a month, one person must be chosen. If your name is called, do not resist. 9. If you hear your name whispered from the forest, ignore it. I haven't learned to control this body yet. I slipped the note under her door, hoping she would heed the warnings I had ignored. As I retreated to the forest's edge, I felt a strange mixture of grief for my lost humanity and wonder at what I had become. The forest speaks through me now. I understand the rules. They're not to protect us from them. They're to protect them from what we might become. From the edge of the woods, I watch over Black Hollow. I am both guardian and prisoner, protector and predator. And when the harvest moon rises again, I will help choose the next offering, even as part of me mourns the necessity. Welcome to Black Hollow. Please follow the rules. They keep us all safe.